Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our Renewable Energy webinar on Duke Energy's North Carolina CPRE program. I'm Patty Sager, Director of Williams Mullen's marketing team, and I have a few housekeeping matters to go over quickly before we begin our program. At any point during the presentation, you may submit your questions using the questions button located in the lower part of your screen. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Also, if you're having any audio or technical problems, please use that same question button and we will help you resolve them. Now I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Brad Nowak. Brad Nowak is co-chair of Williams Mullen's Energy team, where he represents developers and owners on renewable energy and infrastructure projects throughout the U.S. Brad has extensive experience in the area of renewable project development, including energy regulations, corporate financing, EPC and design build construction, and O&M contracts, and energy facility acquisitions and divestitures. Let me turn it over to Brad in Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Patty. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Renewable Energy Project Development webinar. Joining me today is my co-chair, Bob Riley, also with Williams Mullen, located in Washington. Bob is co-chair of Williams Mullen's Energy team. He's been advising energy clients for more than 30 years and has an extensive energy project development background. Before joining Williams Mullen, Bob was general counsel for subsidiaries of a major independent power producer. In addition, he was a trial attorney at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. He has represented clients before FERC and numerous state public utility commissions, including in North Carolina and Virginia. We also are pleased to be joined by our colleague Jennifer Morgan, located in our Raleigh, North Carolina office. Jennifer focuses her practice on utilities law and the representation of businesses and municipalities in various regulatory proceedings before the North Carolina Utilities Commission. Her representative matters include applications for and transfers of certificates of public convenience and necessity, applications for rate increases, and representation of solar power producers in rulemaking proceedings. We are pleased that you have joined us for what promises to be a very timely and relevant discussion on the latest developments on Duke Energy's North Carolina CPRE program. We have a number of topics to cover in our 30-minute webinar today. Just as a roadmap of the topics we're going to discuss today, we'll first begin with a background of HB 589 and the Part 2 implementation, including the various rulemaking proceedings at the North Carolina Utilities Commission. We'll then move to discuss the Commission's recent February 21, 2018 order, which approved Duke Energy's CPRE program with numerous modifications. In particular, we're going to discuss the Commission's 12 issues that they've raised in their February 21st order. After discussing a few takeaways, we'll then take questions at the end. And just as a reminder that if you've got any questions during the presentation, just feel free to type them into the question box in the lower bottom of your screen. Now let's begin with our presentation with the background of HB 589. Just as background, HB 589 is known as, it's the title of Competitive Energy Solutions for North Carolina Law, was enacted in summer of 2017. HB 589 contains 14 parts. Today's webinar will focus on Part 2, also known as the Competitive Procurement of Renewable Energy, or CPRE. The 2017 law establishes a framework and competitive process for Duke Energy companies to procure 2,660 megawatts of additional renewable energy resource capacity over a period of 45 months. Over that period, Duke plans to conduct 4 solicitations, also known as tranches, for the procurement of 2,660 megawatts. That amount is also known as Duke's total obligation. The first tranche, or solicitation, will begin this year and will be for 680 megawatts. That amount is allocated between 600 would be for Duke Energy Carolina Service Territory, and 80 megawatts would be for Duke Energy Progress Service Territory. Now, eligible facilities are defined as those facilities that use renewable energy resources as its primary source of fuel, have a nameplate rating of 80 megawatts or less, and are placed into service after the beginning of the CPRE program procurement period. Wind facility projects will not be accepted in the first solicitation due to HB 589's moratorium on wind facilities, but that is expected to expire on December 31st of this year. However, Duke has indicated in its CPRE program documents that wind facilities may be included in future solicitations. And in terms of the procurement and administration of that, there will be an independent administrator who has been selected and approved by the Commission as Axion Group. And for those that are familiar with projects in Georgia, Axion Group was also the administrator in those procurements. But that is the background. Following just a timeline of the key activities regarding the Part 2 implementation, beginning with the law being passed in July of 2017, the Rules Order R871 in November of 2017, and then the program guidelines and plan, which Duke submitted at the end of November. In December, Duke recommended the selection of Axion as an independent administrator, and earlier this year in January, the Utilities Commission approved that selection. And that leads us to just a few weeks ago where the Utilities Commission approved the Duke CPRE program with numerous modifications, including their plan and performa PPA. And as noted on the chart, May is the expected date when the first tranche solicitation is to begin. So with that as an overview, I'll pass it to my colleague, Jennifer Morgan, who described the various proceedings at the Utilities Commission and some of the issues raised in the February 21st order. Jennifer?
Thank you, Brad. This is Jennifer Morgan. This slide, we're talking about the relevant North Carolina Utilities Commission dockets for the HB 589 implementation. And for those of you who may have been in our webinar last month, we went into these in more detail then. But the first is E100 sub 150. That's the Commission's rulemaking docket to implement the provisions of the statute passed by the General Assembly, and Rule R871 is what has come from that. And that's, again, the Commission's rule to implement the provisions of HB 589 requiring the CPRE program. E100 sub 151 is the selection of the independent administrator that Brad mentioned with Axion. And then E7 sub 1156 and E2 sub 1159 are the primary dockets we're talking about today regarding the CPRE program implementation. And those are the dockets in which the Commission issued its February 21st order that we're going to talk about in more detail. A little bit of background leading up to the Commission's order. On November 27th, 2017, Duke Energy submitted the following proposed CPRE documents. It was its initial CPRE program guidelines, which were the terms and conditions and the process for participating in the initial CPRE RFP solicitation. And those were filed pursuant to the Commission's Rule R871C. Duke filed a proforma power purchase agreement to be offered in the Tranche 1 CPRE RFP. It filed its initial CPRE program plan, and this was a general forward-looking compliance planning document regarding Duke Energy's plans to meet the CPRE total obligation through the end of the procurement period. And Duke had also filed its request for waiver of regulatory conditions and code of conduct requirements, in which it requested the Commission waive certain requirements relating to pricing and information that's publicly available, advance notice, things of that nature that it wanted waived during that time. After Duke filed that on November 27th, 2017, the Commission issued an order requiring the public staff to review it and file its comments. The public staff did file a report and initial comments on January 10th, 2018, which we went into more detail during our last webinar, but generally, accepting the Duke filings with some modifications. Other parties, business and trade groups, the NCC-EBA and the NCSEA, filed their comments regarding Duke's proposal. January 26th, Duke filed reply comments, and then the public staff filed additional reply comments on January 28th. The news since then is that on February 21st, the Utilities Commission issued its order modifying and approving Duke's joint CPRE program. And the order took into account the filings made by the public staff and the other parties, as well as Duke. We'll talk about that in more detail here. On February 21st, again, the Commission issued its order modifying and approving the joint CPRE program and approving and accepting Duke's CPRE program with some modifications. So this paves the way to move forward with the CPRE. There's four main parts of the order, and then we're also going to talk about these in more detail. The first requires Duke to modify its CPRE program guidelines and initial CPRE program plan to conform with the Utilities Commission's conclusions. Secondly, the order accepted the CPRE program guidelines and plan once modified by Duke. So it's requesting Duke make modifications and then it's going ahead and approving that. It's approved the use of Duke's proposed pro forma PPA for the Tranche 1 RFP solicitation only. And it granted Duke's waiver of the regulatory conditions and the Code of Conduct requirements. The Commission's order addressed 12 issues, and you can see those listed here. My colleagues are going to go into more detail about some of these later, but the first part of the order was about grid locational guidance. The Commission's rule has provided that the CPRE program shall, if designated by location, include an explanation of how the public utility has determined the location allocation within its balancing authority area. Some of the parties in filings have said that Duke cannot designate the specific locations where the project must be sited for the market participants to bid in Tranche 1. The Commission said that Duke was not, Duke has elected not to designate that, but it shall continue to refine and update its information through future CPRE programs in tranches 2 to 4, as it's committed to do in its reply comment. In other words, the Commission agreed with Duke's filing, and then Duke shall continue and update the information about grid locational guidelines. Another part of the Utilities Commission's order on February 21st was regarding the contracting period. And this part of the order, Duke had set out a proposed RFP solicitation schedule with a 90-day contracting period following each bid evaluation period for each tranche or RFP solicitation. Some of the other parties filing comments, NCC-EBA and NCSEA, had objected to the length of the contracting period, saying that 30 days would have been more appropriate. But what the Commission did, it said that it wasn't persuaded that there should be a modification to the 90-day contracting period at this time, but it did say it wanted Duke to move as expeditiously as possible to execute contracts with the facility owners that have submitted the proposals. And Duke committed to do that in its reply comment. So the Commission agreed with that 90-day contracting period. Then the next part of the order, the third point, was regarding the acceleration of Tranche 4 to July 2020. Duke had set out its timetable for proposals in its filings. Some of the other parties had wanted an accelerated schedule to allow for cost-effective projects. The Commission found Duke's proposed procurement schedule as reasonable and it meets the requirements of the statute. And that will continue to be evaluated as we move forward. On this slide, you can see the timeline we've set out for the CPRE program RFP solicitation timeline. And it shows all 4 tranches over the 45-month CPRE procurement period. In blue is the RFP response period, gray the bid evaluation and shortlist period, and yellow is the contracting period. You'll see that the initial Tranche 1 solicitation is expected to begin soon, here in a couple months in May 2018. There's the RFP solicitation period, and then the Tranche 1 contracting period is set to begin in late 2018 and end in early 2019. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague to discuss the next points of the Commission's February 21st order.
Thanks, Jennifer. Issue number 4 that was raised in the Commission's order pertains to the reasonableness of Duke's market participant requirements. On the slide in front of you, Duke has proposed 12 general requirements as part of the submission of proposals. A few issues were raised in the Commission's order pertaining to these requirements. The first issue pertained to the minimum facility size of a project. HB 589 provides that the facility generation eligibility ranges from 1 megawatt to 80. And Duke argued in its petition that it should retain flexibility to increase the minimum facility size above 1 megawatt if, as part of that procurement, its experience demonstrates that these projects are not likely to be successful. The Commission addressed it, that basically saying that because this was only a item that Duke had floated about raising the minimum above 1 megawatt, rather than being proposed at this time, that they were going to consider it whenever Duke may propose that. Another issue that was addressed pertained to the disclosure of post-contract term revenue assumptions for both the utility and non-utility market participants. The NCSEA, NCBA, and NCSEA and Duke Renewables all argued about disclosure of such revenue assumptions was inconsistent with Rule R871. And Duke, in its filing, had actually offered that such information would only apply for Duke, the utility, and they agreed that with Duke's proposal, just to limit it to that, to the utility. Another issue addressed being able to cure proposals if there were errors in it, and the Commission concluded that Duke should be allowed and be required to allow for a cure period. However, they limited the cure for only non-substantive deficiencies, and they didn't address particularly what those would be. And finally, a big issue was raised concerning about the waiver of rights when submitting a proposal. As part of Duke's CPRE guidelines, Duke had indicated that by submitting a proposal, participants would waive their rights as part of that. And the Commission found that the waiver was overbroad and should be deleted. So Duke, as part of its final guidelines, will either remove it or indicate that market participants have a right to initiate a complaint with the Commission. Issue number 5 pertained to the elimination of asset transfer proposals. Duke has proposed 3 types of transaction structures for projects. Power purchase agreements, asset acquisitions, of which there were 3 types of those, and finally utility self-developed facilities. In comments by some responders, they've argued that the renewable resource asset transfer proposal cost structure, which would be the first one under asset acquisition, should be eliminated, particularly because that their partially developed facilities cannot be fairly priced and compared to the other facilities that are being proposed. And the Commission actually agreed with Duke that Duke had distinguished that particular project structure enough to warrant its inclusion, at least for tranche number 1. So it's possible that that may change in future tranches. Issue number 6 that was addressed in the Commission's order dealt with how the avoided cost rate would be used as part of the solicitation. Duke had proposed that the pre-solicitation information published by the independent administrator would include Duke's 20-year avoided cost rates using the PICO methodology, and that's the way they would evaluate Tranche 1 proposals. Some respondents request additional details as to how the pricing and scoring would work, including how bids would then be translated into a rate structure. The Commission agreed that Duke should provide additional details, so whenever the final solicitation is developed, that's going to be a very important point to look at. Issue number 7 pertained to the 30% limit. Part 2 of HB 589 included a limitation that Duke can satisfy no more than 30% of the utility's competitive procurement through its own development of facilities. And this limitation did not apply for facilities that were acquired by Duke that were selected through the competitive procurement and that were located within their service territory. And as part of this, there were 3 issues that Duke had raised in its petition that the Commission addressed. The first was whether PPA proposals offered by a Duke affiliate would count towards the 30% limit. The second issue that Duke asked about was whether the 30% limit would apply for the total aggregate obligation, the 2,660 megawatt procurement obligation, rather than individual RFP solicitations. And then the final issue was whether or not the asset acquisition proposals would count towards the 30% limit. The Commission addressed each of those, and for the first issue, the Commission agreed with Duke's proposal that the PPA proposals offered by a Duke affiliate would count towards the 30% limit. The Commission also agreed with Duke to apply the 30% limit to the total CPRE obligation of the 2,660 megawatts rather than individual RFP solicitations. They basically agreed that it would be more straightforward to monitor over the entire procurement rather than individualized procurements. And then finally, the third issue about the asset acquisitions counting towards the 30% limit. The Commission agreed with Duke and found its arguments persuasive and determined that the asset transfer plus EPC cost proposal would not count towards the 30% limit because they view that the development is complete and only construction through the EPC is required to bring the facility online. So now I'll pass it to Bob Riley, who will address the remaining issues.
Thank you, Brad, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to address issues 8, 9, 10, and 12. We will be skipping issue 11 in this webinar today. Issue 8, the grouping study. Duke had proposed a process to evaluate the potential network upgrade cost as part of step 1. However, the Commission disagreed and has ordered that Duke modify its guidelines to implement a single-track, two-step process as was spelled out in the rules. A little background here is helpful. The NCUC rules require that the evaluation of the RFP proposals proceed in 2 steps. In the first step, the independent administrator evaluates proposals but keeps the respondents' names and information confidential. In step 2, Duke is required to select the proposals in the order ranked by the independent administrator until the total capacity is satisfied. But Duke noted that one of the most complex issues related to the CPRE program has been determining how to most efficiently and equitably manage the interconnection request in a queue priority, as well as the logistics of processing interconnection queues for both existing projects that may not elect to participate in this RFP and in the RFP respondents that are being developed at the same time. So, as such, Duke proposed the grouping studies method to address this complexity, but as mentioned earlier, the Commission denied that request and directed that Duke proceed as spelled out in the rule with one small modification. The Commission allowed that Duke should consider and incorporate consideration of grid upgrade costs and allow Duke to make a reasonable assignment of those costs to the proposal where possible. So, proposals that require substantial grid upgrade costs will likely be eliminated as being less cost efficient compared to those projects that do not, even if the price of those projects falls below Duke's avoided costs. I think that's an important issue that is kind of buried in this grouping study proposal. All right, moving to issue number 9, cost recovery. The Commission has approved Duke's proposal to recover network upgrade costs through future Duke rates. That's a big deal. By way of background, the program guidelines required that a participant responding to the RFP must also have submitted an interconnection request and have received a queue number before they submit their bid. As such, the participant will be required to submit a bid into the Tranche 1 RFP before either the system impact study or the facilities study in both North Carolina and South Carolina interconnection procedures will be completed. As you know, that's how Duke determines the detailed costs of interconnection facilities, by using those 2 studies. So to mitigate the risk, Duke has proposed segregating network upgrade costs from proposal costs. Traditionally, all interconnection costs are assigned to the interconnection customer, In this case, however, the Commission agreed with Duke and determined that the network upgrade costs are the type of costs that might be appropriately recovered through Duke in a rate case. So that's a big issue, actually. As opposed to having those costs assigned to the interconnection customer, the Commission determined that network upgrade costs can be recovered by Duke in base rates. All right, issue 10, curtailment provisions of the PPA. Duke's pro forma PPA permitted Duke to dispatch, operate, and control facilities in the same manner as their own resources. These provisions included an annual threshold curtailment equivalent to 5% for Duke Energy Carolinas and 10% in Duke Energy Progress. Above those thresholds, Duke is required to pay the facility owner at the full contract price for each megawatt hour delivered that could have been generated but was not because of the dispatch down. First, the Commission determined that Duke's proposed curtailment thresholds are appropriate for use in Tranche 1. The Commission indicated that it will monitor this issue and remain open to alternative methods, but it is okay to proceed with that method in Tranche 1. Second, the Commission required that Duke submit reports concerning the curtailment issues for further study as the process continues. All right, issue 12, the reasonableness of the PPA provisions. Initially, the Commission rejected Duke's argument that the Commission should not be the arbiter of the commercial reasonableness of the terms of the pro forma PPA. The Commission went out of its way to assert that the Commission has a statutory mandate to review and approve the terms and conditions of the pro forma PPA. So, notwithstanding that, however, the Commission indicated that Duke's use of the pro forma PPA as submitted was approved for Tranche 1 solicitation only. The Commission directed Duke to further evaluate whether specific revisions are appropriate, but did accept the representation that the pro forma is similar to contracts that have been accepted and used in other projects. Likewise, the Commission accepted comments by the NCCBA and NCCA that some of the provisions may challenge market participants obtaining financing, but the Commission directed that the parties should discuss those issues as they go forward. Therefore, the Commission approved the use of Duke's pro forma PPA in the Tranche 1 solicitation only, and stay tuned for further develops on this as the independent operator moves forward. So, all right, Bradley, that's it on item 12.
Thanks, Bob. We've got a couple minutes left in our webinar. We do have a key takeaways, but thought we would get to some of the questions that we have here. The first question that we've got is, does the CPRE program apply for projects in Dominion, North Carolina's territory? Bob, do you mind responding?
Sure. No, this CPRE program is only applicable to Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolina service territory in both North and South Carolina, but it does not include Dominion's service territory. All right, Brad, there's another question in here if I can ask. The question is, for asset acquisitions, has Duke proposed any pro forma contracts, or would the contracts be negotiated with Duke if a project is selected?
Yeah, well, Duke has, as we talked about, Duke has proposed their pro forma PPA, which was accepted by the Commission for at least tranche number 1. But Duke has not proposed any EPC contracts or even asset acquisition agreements. In their guidelines, in Duke's guidelines that submitted in late November, they indicated that developers would actually propose EPC agreements as part of their project proposal, and other asset acquisition agreements would then also have to be negotiated with Duke.
Here's a follow-up question that I think is related. The question says, can a respondent file or submit multiple proposed types regarding one facility?
Yes. Duke indicates in their guidelines that a proposal sponsor can submit multiple proposals. for a single facility using different cost structures. But basically they would be separate proposals, so that would mean that there would have to be separate proposal fees and proposal bonds for each of those submissions. So I see that we're out of time, so I want to thank Jennifer Morgan and also my co-chair Bob Riley for their great work on today's program. I also want to thank the webinar participants for attending and sending in questions. Sorry we didn't have a chance to get through all of the questions. If you've got any, please feel free to email us at solar@williamsmullen.com. Or if you'd like to get on our mailing list for future webinars, please also email us there as well. And our contact information is also included. Thanks again for attending, and have a great day.